Fellas, I think it's safe to say the UFC haven't been producing the best cards this year. It feels like the middle of this year specifically. We keep having terrible cards, both in fight nights and pay-per-views, and I've been looking at the cards recently, especially after UFC 306, and how much of a success the Sophia was. I've been looking through the upcoming cards, both fight nights and pay-per-views that we've got coming up, and I've realised that UFC cards are actually starting to get good again. Like I said before, we have been having these mediocre fight nights, these mediocre pay-per-views. It feels like ever since UFC 300, everything about the UFC kind of felt mediocre, but I feel like recently with these cards that have got up and coming, most of these cards, like every single fight night and pay-per-view pretty much that is scheduled to the end of the year, has multiple good fights in it. I mean, if we look at this weekend with UFC Paris, let's start there. Really good fight night. Obviously, it's in Paris. Paris is one of the best crowds. And even this is a really good card as well. Benoit Saint Denis versus Renato Moicano was the main event. Really good main event. I think it's a super intriguing fight. I'm pretty sure Moicano's won like 4 of his last 5, obviously on a bit of a streak now. And Benoit Saint Denis, I want to see how he does against a ranked lightweight when he isn't getting jumped all the way to a massive fight against Dustin Poirier and he's getting someone more around his skill level. I think that's a super intriguing fight. Both of them are super well-rounded. Both of them are really good in certain areas. I think this is a really good fight in Paris for Benoit Saint Denis' return. And of course, no one wants to reject a fight with Moicano. If Moicano can beat Benoit Saint Denis as well, Moicano versus Pimlet is one of the most intriguing fights to make. And again, if Benoit Saint Denis can beat Moicano, he's going to be getting a top 10 fight and he's not going to be getting rushed against somebody like Poirier. So I think the main event already for this weekend, not this weekend, but next weekend, is super interesting. I think this is a really good main event for Paris. And even though, well, I had a lot of concerns when the UFC were coming to Paris and Cyril Gane went on the card, but I think this is a really good fight as well. But it's not only that, it's the core main event. Allen and Imavov. Any other fight night card, this is the main event. I mean, you've got Imavov, who's kind of like the French Dagestani. He kind of, represents both of them. And they've got Brendan Allen as well. I really like this fight as well. Two up-and-coming contenders right now in the middleweight division. Middleweight's full of contenders, so I like it when we get these kind of contender versus contender fights. They've both been looking amazing recently. Obviously, Imavov with his wins over guys like Delidze and Cannonier, and Brendan Allen's just been on an absolute streak. I think this is such an intriguing fight. It's the toughest fight that Allen's had in a while. It's the toughest fight that Imavov's had in a while. I think stylistically, it's a really interesting fight. And the winner of this fight is probably going to get put into a number 1 contender fight, potentially against somebody like Whitaker, Strickland, Izzy, one of the top middleweights in the world. And I think undoubtedly they deserve it. And like I said, a core main event for a fight night having Allen and Imavov. I really like this fight. Any other card, this is a fight night main event. So I think already the core main event between Allen and Imavov is amazing. Joanderson Brito versus William Gomez. I've said this before. I think Joanderson Brito is definitely the best unranked featherweight in the world. He's been on an absolute tear recently. He's so well-rounded. He's so dangerous. William Gomez has looked really good too. And Joanderson Brito, he's actually got some really good wins on his name. His last win against Jack Shaw at UFC 301, where he just slashed his leg open, knocked out Andre Philly. That comeback win against Jonathan Pierce. He even beat Diego Lopez on the Contender Series a few years back as well, which not a lot of people remember. And I think him versus William Gomez, who's also had his come up in the UFC, is a really good fight. I think this is the featured fight of the card, but I think undoubtedly the winner of this fight is going to get a fight in the featherweight division. So I think this is going to be a banger as well. And if, like I said, if you haven't checked these guys out, you got to go do that. And then Kevin Jette versus Brian Battle. 2 tough middleweights. Kevin Jette is a big prospect right now in the UFC. Big French prospect in the middleweight division. I think he's got a lot of potential. He's looked really good in his 2 fights in the UFC. I mean, he did debut against Kiefer Crosby, which isn't the highest level opponent, but still, he looked really good in the UFC. And seeing him against Brian Battle, who's also looked really good. He kind of got done dirty in his last fight with a no contest when his opponent was looking for a way out, but he's still a really good fight right there as well. And then not even to mention, like, the return of Matt Frivola against Ziam, Ludovic Klein versus Roosevelt Roberts. There's just so many good fights on UFC Paris that I can't wait for. And I think overall for a fight night, I know it's in front of a crowd and all the crowded fight nights are always good, but it's just a really good card. And then for the week after that, we've got UFC 307, and I think this is a super underrated card. I only hear people saying bad things about UFC 307, but when you break down the card from start to finish, it's honestly one of the best kind of cards that we've had this year from start to finish. I mean, the main event, Alex Pereira versus Khalil Rountree. First thing I'm going to say, Alex Pereira main events never disappoint. Okay, maybe it's not the Ankalaev fight which we were all wanting, and maybe Khalil Rountree is a bit of a random opponent, but stylistically, this actually has really potential to be a good fight, and there's no way this doesn't end in a finish. You've got Khalil Rountree, some of the best display of Muay Thai in the light heavyweight division against the best striker right now in the light heavyweight division. It's either going to be Alex Pereira, sleeping Khalil Rountree, which is the obvious pick, or it's going to be a massive upset from Khalil Rountree, but there's no way this is a boring fight. So that's a really good main event, and like I said, there's never and Alex Pera main event that disappoints. Co-main event, okay, maybe it's not the fight we all wanted to see. Maybe it's, you know, one of the worst title fights you can make in the UFC, but at least it's a co-main event and it's not a main event. And at the end of the day, it's still a title fight. Even if it's probably the worst title fight in the UFC, it's still a title fight. It's still something to add to the card. But most importantly, the featured fight, Jose Aldo versus Mario Bautista. The return of Jose Aldo. Not the return because he already returned, but just another fight with Aldo. And I'm going to tune into every single minute of every Aldo fight from now on, with gratitude as well, because I was so worried that, well, not worried, but I was so disappointed that Merab was the guy to retire Jose Aldo after that performance. I'm glad that he came back and beat Jonathan Martinez. Looked really good as well, so I'm intrigued to see how it is against Mario Bautista. And if Aldo wins, he's going to be against one of the top contenders of the bantamweight division, which I can't wait to see as well. That's going to be super interesting. And even if Mario Bautista does win, and I've already said I don't really like this matchmaking, I would have preferred if it was like somebody like Cejudo, but at least if Bautista wins, he would have made his name off Jose Aldo, and I do think that Mario Bautista is the dark horse of the bantamweight division, so it's not that bad of a fight, and at least we get to see Jose Aldo come back. Then we've got Aljamain Sterling versus Movsar. Okay, they might both be boring in their own right, because it's usually them just out-grappling opponents, making dominant performances, or just getting these close fights, but not these close fights, but having these good performances. But I want to see how they do against each other. Two of some of the best grapplers right now in the featherweight division. Obviously, you got Movsar Evloev, got that really close win over Arnold Allen, has kind of been beating these contenders, undefeated, good grappler, very questionable guy, against Aljamain Sterling, who obviously former bantamweight champion, got KO'd by O'Malley, came up to the featherweight division, dominated Calvin Kattar. They've been talking a lot on Twitter. I'm actually quite intrigued to see how their grappling goes against each other, so I think that's another interesting fight. Roman Dolidze versus Kevin Holland. I assume Kevin Holland's here to stay in the middleweight division. He went to middleweight obviously a few years back, looked really good, and now he's back, and he's going to be taking on Roman Dolidze, who's coming off that, bit of a shit win over Anthony Smith, but at least we're getting to see Kevin Holland out there again. It's very rare that we see Kevin Holland in a boring fight. Him versus Dolidze, I don't mind the matchmaking at this point in their career, because Kevin Holland, I think the UFC have kind of realised that feeding Kevin Holland to these up-and-comers, or these top contenders, isn't the right idea. Just feed him to these random ranked opponents across multiple divisions, and that's what Kevin Holland tends to do the best at. So I'm not a massive hater of Dolidze versus Holland, and that's not even to mention the other fights on this card. Wonderboy versus Buckley. That's an absolute banger right there as well. Kayla Harrison versus Vieira. Kayla Harrison might be one of the most interesting female fighters right now, especially after she dominated Holly Holm. I honestly think she's going to take over the bantamweight division. OSP versus Ryan Spann, a battle of the shit light heavyweights. Rodriguez versus Lucindo as well. Obviously, just fought UFC 300 did Rodriguez. I think this is quite an interesting fight. So I think UFC 307 from top to bottom is actually a really good card. And then after that, we've got Royval versus Tyra. Again, one of the best fights you can make right now in the flyweight division. Number 1 ranked Royval, coming off an upset win over Brandon Moreno against undefeated Tatsuro Tyra, who displayed some of the best grappling in his last fight when he fought, who did he fight? Alex Perez. This is just a really good fight in the flyweight division. Probably the winner of this is going to fight for a belt, because at this point, Royval would have beaten Tyra and Moreno in a row. He's probably going to get another shot at Pantoja, and if Tyra wins, undoubtedly he's getting a title shot. So it's a number 1 contender fight. I think it's super interesting stylistically as well, because it's the toughest test of Tyra's career against one of the best strikers in the flyweight division right now, a guy who's fought many names. And same for Brandon Royval. He's having to face a crafty grappler like Tatsuro Tyra, who looked amazing against Alex Perez, and he's undefeated as well. So I think that's a really good main event. And then the next, another fight on the card, which I just got to mention, Chris Barnett versus Waldo Cortez Acosta. Listen, we all know the unranked space of the heavyweight division is pretty terrible, but this might be one of the best unranked heavyweight fights we've actually got right now. It is quite questionable with the matchmaking. I don't really know why Waldo Cortez Acosta deserves to fight Chris Barnett, who, even though he's entertaining in and out the octagon, he's not the best talent. But at the end of the day, like I said, we are getting to see Chris Barnett. We're getting to see him against Waldo Cortez Acosta, who's kind of been playing the villain in the heavyweight division, went out there, mocked Arlovski, shut down Rebellis Despain, and now is going to be taking on another fan favourite in Chris Barnett. So even though I do think it's going to be a Waldo Costa domination, it's still it's an intriguing fact to see what Chris Barnett does. If Chris Barnett can somehow beat Waldo Cortez Acosta, that's probably going to be my favourite win we've seen in the heavyweight division for a while. And then the other fights on this card as well, Rafa Garcia, who's going to be taking on Grant Dawson. Themba Garimbo, the guy who The Rock gifted a house to against old Nico Price, who shouldn't be in the UFC anymore. Brad Tavares rescheduled against Park. Obviously, that fight was supposed to be in a different fight. Now it's now been rescheduled. Jonathan Pierce on the card as well. Polyana Viana, with so many good fights on this card as well, and for a fight night as well. And then after that, Michelle Pera versus Anthony Hernandez. If you've seen my videos, you'll know how many times I've talked about this fight. This might be one of my favourite fights that the UFC have actually booked right now. Michel Pereira versus Anthony Hernandez is such a good fight because they're two massive prospects in the middleweight division. They've both been on a streak recently. They're both super excited in their own rights. They're both ranked in the middleweight division. And the winner of this fight is going to get a massive win. And I think this is a massive fight from there. And I just think this is such a good fight in the middleweight division because it's not like we're giving them, you know, someone who's kind of washed in the middleweight division. It's not like we're giving them to a Roman Dolidze or a Marvin Vettori. I really like it when the UFC put two guys who are on the come up, who have looked really good recently, who are both really dangerous against each other, and that's exactly what we're seeing with Michel Pereira and Anthony Hernandez. And I feel like even though it would have made more sense to put it on UFC 306, having it as a Fight Night main event, it's definitely going to be one of the better Fight Night main events we've got, even though, like I said, and like I've been reviewing, we've already got some amazing main events this year, but this is one of my favourite fights that we have coming up, even on that card as well. Rob Font versus Kyler Phillips. You've got Rob Font, a guy who's fought so many names in the bantamweight division, really good boxer, definitely got the material to throw check people, as we saw against Adrian Yanez. Against Kyler Phillips, who's kind of been on his come up in the bantamweight division, he's looked really good recently. I feel like that's another really good striking matchup to make in the bantamweight division. They've both had so many fun fights. Kyler Phillips' fight with Pedro Munoz was fun. It's very rare that we see Rob Font who's not in a fun fight. That's another amazing fight for this card. Mateusz Nicola versus Almabayev. You've got Almabayev, this big prospect right now in the flyweight division, and he's got a lot of potential. He's looked really good in the fights that he's had so far in the UFC, taking on another contender in Nicolau, who's kind of fell short, but he's still a top contender in that. Well, I won't say a top contender, but he's still a contender in the flyweight division. So another big fight that we get in there. I mean, you know, you can't complain about. We've got Rebelis Despain on that card as well, the guy who just got fraud checked, but still, I think he's got a lot of potential in the heavyweight division if he just plays his cards right and improves his grappling and maybe his stamina. And he's just been gifted a free win. Austin Lane, he's practically Greg Hardy part 2. I think he's an NFL player who had knockout power, so he kind of got taken to the UFC. And now it's just going to be another quick, or hopefully another quick win for Rebelis Despain. But we're getting to see Rebelis Despain and how much he's improved since his last fight. So there's so many good fights on this card overall. We've got the return of Charles Johnson as well, who's probably the best unranked flyweight right now. We've got Jake Hadley versus Hindstand. Jake Hadley made his move to the bantamweight division and looked better than he ever has looked in the flyweight division. We've got Brad Katona, the winner of the Ultimate Fighter, against Matsumoto, who's a massive prospect as well and has a lot of questions to be answered. I think that's another really interesting fight that the UFC have made. Darren Elkins versus Pineda, that's just going to be an absolute war between two legends as well. So I feel like that card again is super stacked. And then we've got UFC 308, quite possibly the most stacked main card of the entire year. One of the most stacked main cards we've ever seen in UFC history. And to top off the main card, we have, and like I said with Michel Pera and Anthony Hernandez, that might be one of my favourite fights, but this, if you've been watching the channel recently, I've said in multiple videos, is my favourite fight that has currently been booked by the UFC. Ilia Topuria versus Max Holloway is a fantasy fight that has come true. It's such a good fight, especially at this point in their careers. Ilia Topuria coming off a massive knockout win over Alexander Volkanovski. Max Holloway coming off a massive knockout win over Justin Gaethje. A guy who's always been one of the top fighters in the featherweight division, who is beating everybody but Volkanovski, versus the guy who's kind of an undefeated guy who's slowly come up in the featherweight division and beaten Alexander Volkanovski where no other featherweight has. It's such a fun fight. They're both fun fighters. They're both great boxers. They both have been looking amazing recently. It's the best fight that the UFC have going right now. And this already, you know, I don't need to sell it for you. The fight's going to sell itself. And then the core main event, Whitaker versus Chimaev. Again, a fight that I was looking forward to at UFC Saudi Arabia. It fell short, and I've heard a lot of complaints that, Chimaev shouldn't deserve this fight. Robert Whitaker, being the BMF he is, was the guy who actually called for this fight to be rescheduled, and I love this fight as well, because if Chimaev wins, he would have proved himself against a top contender, and he's probably going to get gifted a title shot if he beats Whitaker, rightfully so, and I'm interested to see how Chimaev does against a middleweight as good as Robert Whitaker, a top 3 greatest middleweights of all time, the guy who went out there in his last fight and completely just destroyed Ikram Aliskerov, and before that had a good performance against Paulo Costa, one of the best strikers in the division, the biggest test of Chimaev's career. I think Whitaker versus Chimaev as a core main event again is such a good fight to make. Cyril Gane versus Alexander Volkov, the rematch. I said this in a video last week. I think right now this is the best fight between two pure strikers right now in the heavyweight division, and I just can't wait to see it. I know there's guys like Aspinall who have hands as well, but I think if Aspinall was to fight Cyril Gane or Volkov, he'd just take them down within minutes and sub them like he did to Volkov a few years ago. But when you've got Gane and Volkov, it's going to be a striking war. You've got Cyril Gane, who I would say is the best pure striker in the heavyweight division, or at least one of the most technical strikers, against Alexander Volkov, who's on a 4-fight winning streak, 3 of them coming by way of finish, and just absolutely butchered Undisputed, Sergey Pavlovich. That's another really interesting fight, and I think the winner of that fight is probably going to get the fight against Aspinall for the Undisputed belt. And then Ankalaev versus Rakic. Ankalaev, the guy who everyone thinks should be fighting for the belt next. Maybe he should be fighting Pera, but I think this is another interesting matchup for Ankalaev. There's no doubts that if he beats Rakic, he's going to be fighting for a belt, but I think this is also an intriguing matchup. You've got Ankalaev, who's got good hands, against a guy with really good kickboxing in Alexander Rakic, who was piecing up Jiri Prochazka previous to that knockout loss. I think obviously Ankalaev's the favourite going to this fight for good reason, but Rakic is a tough guy. He's got really good kickboxing, and I think this is another good fight. And if Rakic can pull off the upset, he's going to be fighting for a belt, and I think this is kind of the #1 contender fight, or at least the winner of this fight will be fighting Pera for the belt, or obviously Roundtree if he manages to get the win. Murphy versus Ige. I like this fight a lot as well, because if Dan Ige wins, I mean, Dan Ige is already a fan favourite after UFC 303. If he can shut down undefeated Lerone Murphy, that's really good for Dan Ige. And again, for Lerone Murphy, the dude's a dark horse of the featherweight division. Nobody's really talking about him. If he can beat Dan Ige, that's a really good win on his resume. And from there, we can see him against these other top featherweights in the top 10 of the featherweight division. So I think this is another quite interesting matchup. Maybe it's not going to be an absolute, maybe it's not the best matchmaking, but I can say it is probably going to be a war. Murphy just had a really interesting fight with Edson Barboza. Can't believe he didn't finish him. Dan Ige is never really in a boring fight, so I think it is going to be a war. So I can't wait for that fight too. And then the other fights on this card as well that I haven't even mentioned. Jeff Neal versus Dos Sanchos. Again, quite dodgy matchmaking, but at least we get to see both of them, and I think it is going to be a fun fight. Rinat Fakhretdinov versus Ruzi Boyev. Two good. I kind of want to call them prospects. I don't just want to call everyone a prospect, but they're just two good strikers in the middleweight division as well. We've got Abbas Magomedov against Bruno Ferreira. I love this matchup. Abbas Magomedov has looked really good, especially its improvement since his fight with Strickland. And Bruno Ferreira might be one of the hardest hitting dudes in the UFC. Sharapoutin Magomedov against Ahmed Petrosian. Sharapoutin Magomedov's toughest test in the UFC, and we've seen him back for the third time this year. Mitibek Orobai, the best prospect in the lightweight division, against Rumbetske. And then we've also got Justin Tafa fighting on the card. Bruno Silva, Farid Basra as well, another undefeated fighter. So UFC 308 might be the second best card this year. Such a good pay-per-view. And then after that, we've got Brandon Moreno versus Amir Albazi. Another really good fight. No breaks, just straight into Brandon Moreno versus Amir Albazi. Again, potentially another #1 contender fight in the flyweight division, just like Roy Tyra. If Amir Albazi can beat Brandon Moreno, there's no questions asked. He's going to be getting a title shot. And if Brandon Moreno can get a win over Amir Albazi, that's going to be really good for the former champion. Again, it's just a fight that I really want to see right now in the flyweight division. So that's another good fight, potential #1 contender fight. And then the co-main event. I'm surprised this wasn't a fight night main event. Erin Blankfield versus Rose Namajunas. I'm a really big fan of this matchup. They've both been looking really good. Well, I want to say they've both been looking really good recently. Blankfield did look terrible when she fought Vieira, but at least previous to Vieira, Blankfield had a ton of hype. She was one of the best prospects in women MMA, and she's going to be taking on a former champion in Rose Namajunas, and I think the winner of this fight should probably be fighting Alexa Grasso, and potentially even the backup for like a title fight as well. I think this is a really good matchup. I'm really intrigued to see how Blankfield does against Namajunas, and I'm really interested to see how Namajunas does against her toughest test so far obviously in the new division that she's moved to, in the new flyweight division. Well, I guess she fought Vieira a few years ago, which was her biggest test, but at least her biggest test since then. So I'm excited to see this fight between Namajunas and Blankfield, which in any other circumstance is usually a main event for a fight night. Derek Lewis is going to be back, the knockout artist, taking on Deniz. Now, obviously, it was originally supposed to be fighting Alexander Romanov, but I actually like this matchmaking a lot more. You've got two guys who have the capability to knock people out, which I don't need to tell you that. Just look at their resume. That's literally what Derek Lewis is known for. So it's going to end in a finish. Again, Derek Lewis, I'm surprised he's not in a fight night main event, but we're getting to see him on not even the core main event, but a featured fight for a fight night as well. And even the rest of the fights on this card are amazing as well. Alexander Romanov versus Rodrigo Nascimento. I think the UFC did a really good matchmaking in this fight, because rather than seeing Romanov versus Lewis, we're seeing Romanov against another fat grappler in the heavyweight division in Rodrigo Nascimento. I think that's quite an interesting fight. Well, not maybe an interesting fight. I'm not saying it's going to be a fun fight, but at least you're going to see how two grapplers complement each other and do against each other, especially when they haven't been looking the best recently. So I think that fight alone is really good as well. We've got so many good fights as well on that card. And then even more fights. We've got the return of fraud-checked Mike Mallet taking on Trevin. We've got Andre Barriault versus Stoltzfus, the battle of the journeyman in the middleweight division. We've got Charles Jourdain, who's going to be taking on Henry, the return of another fraud check. Well, not fraud check, but a return of the dude who just got knocked out by Gene Silver. And then we've got UFC 309 Jones versus Stipe. Is this the fight we wanted to see in the heavyweight division? It's not. Everyone wants to see Jones versus Stipe. I've already been very vocal in the past of why I don't like this fight. But at the end of the day, it's been booked now. There's nothing we can really do. We may as well just enjoy the last fight of Jon Jones and the last fight of Stipe Miocic. Even though it shouldn't be for the heavyweight belt, we're going to be seeing them for one last time. The greatest of all time versus the greatest heavyweight of all time. It shouldn't be for the belt, but at least we're going to get to see it one more time. And it's going to be a massive pay-per-view anyway. Regardless of if we like it or not, it's going to sell pay-per-views. Charles Oliveira versus Michael Chandler. This fight is just so good. This is giving me major like 2021 vibes when they fought a few years ago. This entire card is just giving me OG UFC vibes. Obviously, Chandler's kind of quit his run for McGregor now and is going to be taking on Charles Oliveira. I've heard a few people saying that Michael Chandler doesn't deserve it because his only wins are Dan Hooker and Tony Ferguson. At the end of the day, though, cut Chandler some slack. The dude has wasted a couple of years off his UFC career waiting for McGregor. The least you could do is give him a fun matchup in Charles Oliveira. There is no way this goes the distance. It's going to be very fun, just like the first fight was. I can't wait for this fight. And if Michael Chandler can beat Oliveira, he's probably going to be getting a title shot as well. So it's a #1 contender fight for him. Nikita Krylov versus Azamat Murzakanov. I really like this matchup. Nikita Krylov, I've always said, is one of the most underrated light heavyweights, and he's actually alive. We all had questions of whether Nikita Krylov's dead or not. He's actually still alive, and it's going to be taking on Azamat Murzakanov, the undefeated light heavyweight. He's got very, very good boxing, very dangerous. Just went out there in his last fight and demolished Alonzo Medifield. I'm excited to see how Krylov looks in his return against a guy as good as Murzakanov, and if Murzakanov can beat Krylov, we've got a new contender in the light heavyweight division. I think that's another really good fight. Paul Craig versus Bo Nickel. The matchmakers have done a really good job because we're finally seeing Bo Nickel face a test in the middleweight division. We're not seeing him face some Kanu kid from the Contender Series. This is really good matchmaking because Paul Craig, he might have looked washed in his past couple of fights, but he's beaten the likes of Ankalaev, Jamal Hill, Nikita Krylov. And if there's anything that Paul Craig can do to a guy like Bo Nickel, who obviously is going to come with a wrestling approach, it is sub him with a triangle. That's what Paul Craig's known for. He's able to pull off these wacky submissions, but then he's going to be facing one of the biggest prospects in the UFC, a guy who's got hands in Bo Nickel, the biggest prospect versus the biggest prospect killer. Really good matchmaking that the UFC have done here. Chris Weidman's going to be on the card as well. I mean, I'm not too excited to see Chris Weidman, especially after his performance against Bruno Silva, but he's on the card as well. We've got Jonathan Martinez against Marcus as well. I think this is quite a good fight in the bantamweight division as well. It's a good chance to give Marcus a ranked opponent, and I think giving him a guy as fun as Jonathan Martinez isn't a bad option. And even for UFC, like I said, UFC 309, the rest of the fights haven't even been announced for this card. I mean, look at the rest of the year. Never mind UFC 309. Look at the rest of the year. We're probably going to have Bilal and Shavkat maybe at UFC 310 this year. We could have potentially have Pantoja coming back. We could have probably seen Zhang Weili come back in the UFC China main event. So my point is, the UFC cards are starting to get good again. Nearly every single card that we've got coming up in the UFC has multiple good fights in it. I promise I haven't been paid by the UFC to promote the fights. I've just been having a look, and I'm actually really impressed with the fights that we've got coming up. So let me know your thoughts on the current state of the UFC, the fights that we've got coming up, and if you agree, thank you for watching.